Okay, here we go. Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Art Brunch. And I did promise I would include some information about how you can support this mission of mine going forward. That's right here on the next slide. I am now working under the, I guess it's more than a partnership with Pine Street Church's Off-Broadway Arts Ministry. What this is going to allow me to do, it's going to allow me to expand what I do and move into things like film festivals, music festivals, things like that. Because the arts, as you know, is not simply fine art, stuff you see in a museum. It's many things. It's what happens in concert halls and theaters and things like that as well. So I'll be able to do that with this partnership with the Off-Broadway Arts Ministry of Pine Street Church. So if you want to support that, I would love it if you would. Here's how you can do that. You just go to pinestreetchurch.net. And then if you look at the top right bar, you'll see give is an option. You can click on that, and then this screen will pop up that you see here. Click on the green button saying give online, and then it'll take you to this screen. And as you can see, under select a fund on the drop-down menu, you can select Off-Broadway Arts. So if you do believe in this mission of mine and in supporting it, as well as being involved more in it, hearing more announcements about other things that we're doing, like film festivals and music concerts and that sort of thing, then go to this page and appreciate your support. All right, let's move on here. Somebody put in the chat, Osnat's trying to join, just let her know that she can just sit back and relax today, that we already have a co-host. All right, the Art of Wisdom, we're continuing that series, and our second presentation in that series is the Taoist tradition. Taoism is an Eastern philosophy that may be unfamiliar to many of you. It's not that familiar to me. I have taken world religions courses, so I have a vague understanding of it, but there are probably people listening right now who have much more better grasp of what Taoism is. So I really encourage you during the Q&A to share your wisdom with us. I'll do my very best to present it accurately to you today. So Taoism is not well known in the West like various strands of Buddhism are. That being said, I dare to venture that most of us have already received some training in Taoist philosophy. And do you remember where you received your training? Well, this will give it away. If you have seen any of the Star Wars movies, particularly the first three, then you probably possess a vague understanding of the Tao. The two Tao masters who trained us in the Star Wars movies were Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi. They spoke of the Force, the Tao, as an impersonal force. Obi-Wan's exact description of it is an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. The Tao, then, as the force, is the animating force of the universe. Now, George Lucas did corrupt it a bit with the idea of two opposing aspects of the force, the good and the dark side. You remember that, right? Well, in reality, the Tao can't be divided into good and bad, the light side and dark side. That's a foreign concept to the Tao. Here is Lao Tzu. He is said to be the founder of Taoism. We're going to speak a little bit more about him, but he is possibly a completely legendary figure, not really based on any historical person, but that's up for debate. Well, let me go back to him real quick. About this idea that the Tao cannot be divided into good and bad, I'd like to quote something from the Tao Te Ching, which is the main text of Taoism that Lao Tzu is supposedly authored. In verse 2 of the Tao Te Ching, it says, when people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Well, this verse is a warning about making judgments about reality by using binary labels like good and bad. When we do so, we misunderstand reality. Now, Tao, sometimes spelled T-A-O, sometimes spelled D-A-O, but pronounced Tao, means way. And in the context of Chinese philosophy, it does not refer to a particular idiosyncratic way of interpreting life. It refers to the way in all capital letters. In other words, the way of the actual universe in which we live. In Taoist teaching, our goal is to allow this force, the Tao, to flow through us. For this to be possible, we have to let go of any resistance. In practical terms, this means we have to stop trying to control our environment and instead live in harmony with it. Now, Lao Tzu's name means old masters. He supposedly, for those who believe he was a historical figure, supposedly lived in the 6th century BCE. Now, Taoism was a reaction against another popular Eastern philosophy, and that is Confucianism, which began around the same time. So let me briefly compare the two. Confucianism was mainly concerned with order. As we've all experienced, order is difficult to achieve in a society, in a community. And also, it's hard to achieve within ourselves. We're a bit chaotic internally. To achieve order, Confucius emphasized education, particularly education in the ancient traditions. He emphasized sacred texts as authoritative and which prescribe sets of rules and rituals which should govern life. So in this way, Confucianism is a lot like most religions and philosophies in the world. Ancient, authoritative, sacred texts which prescribe sets of rules and rituals to live by. Instead of focusing on metaphysics and nature, which is characteristic of Taoism, Confucianism focused on the practical matters of politics and social life and proper behavior. Confucianism, with its emphasis on rules and rituals, then was really inherently conservative. Confucianism regards human social institutions, including the family, the school, the community, and the state, as essential to human flourishing and moral excellence. Because of its emphasis on ancient traditions and order, Confucianism is inherently hierarchical as well. It's patriarchal. Taoism is different. Even though Taoism does address political matters, it emphasizes what is natural and spontaneous in human experience, even to the point of dismissing much of China's traditions, its advanced culture, its learning, its morality. Now, unlike Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, very little is known about Lao Tzu. This print shows Lao Tzu on a bull. There is one basic story about his life. Here it is. Lao Tzu was an archivist, a librarian, we might say, in the royal court of Cao. All the great books of Chinese culture were housed in Cao's library, and Lao Tzu used his position to devour all of these books and thus to cultivate wisdom. Well, Lao Tzu eventually got sick of court life, and at the age of 80, headed west to the frontier regions to live as a hermit. At the frontier, a guard apprehended the philosopher, refusing to let him travel onwards until he had passed on his wisdom. The legends vary a little bit here. Either Lao Tzu recited the Tao Te Ching and the border guard wrote it down, or Lao Tzu himself wrote it down during the night and gave it to the guard. Either way, after delivering the teaching, the old master continued on his way west, riding on the back of an ox, and he was never seen again. Now, some later accounts say that after heading west from China, Lao Tzu ended up in India, where he became a teacher of the Buddha. But like everything else about Lao Tzu's biography, there is no evidence that any of this is true. Now, in Lao Tzu's teaching, the Tao, which means the way, is central to everything. Here is how the Tao Te Ching describes the Tao. There was something formless and perfect before the universe was born. It is serene, empty, solitary, unchanging, infinite, eternally present. It is the mother of the universe. For lack of a better name, I call it the Tao. It flows through all things, inside and outside, and returns to the origin of all things. The Tao is great. The universe is great. Earth is great. Man is great. These are the four great powers. Man follows the earth. Earth follows the universe. The universe follows the Tao. The Tao follows only itself. This concept of the Tao has some parallels with our concept of God. Both are the source of all, described as ineffable and omnipresent. One contrast, however, is the Western concept of God describes the deity as an intentional creator. The Tao is understood as producing without intention. The Western God plans what comes into existence, whereas the Tao is spontaneous. Another difference is that God in Western conceptions is personal, but the Tao is impersonal. In other words, we can pray to God, but the Tao is not something you pray to. You simply live according to it. Now, I said earlier that Confucianism focuses on ethics and politics, but there are ethical and political ramifications to living in harmony with the Tao. From the Tao Te Ching, verse 8, the supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus, it is like the Tao. In dwelling, live close to the ground. In thinking, keep to the simple. In conflict, be fair and generous. In governing, don't try to control. In work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. Well, in the West, we often speak of the spark of the divine or the divine image being present in all people and even in all things in general. Well, the Tao Te Ching says something similar about the Tao. Every being in the universe is an expression of the Tao. It springs into existence, unconscious, perfect, free, takes on a physical body. Let circumstances complete it. That is why every being spontaneously honors the Tao. The Tao gives birth to all beings, nourishes them, maintains them, cares for them, comforts them, protects them, takes them back to itself, creating without possessing, acting without expecting, guiding without interfering. That is why love of the Tao is in the very nature of things. Now, one thing I want to mention, I didn't even put this in my notes, is that if any of you are familiar with process philosophy and process theology, that is the work of Alfred North Whitehead and his religious disciple, Charles Hartshorne, their concept of God, which many have adopted in the West, is very similar to Eastern concepts like the Tao. So if you want to explore this further and see if you can appropriate the Tao into more familiar perceptions and concepts that we are comfortable with in the West, then you might want to look up process philosophy or process theology. Now, one of the most important principles in Taoism is Wu Wei. Wu Wei literally means non-doing or doing nothing. Well, doing nothing sounds a little bit like the life philosophy of Homer Simpson. But actually, Wu Wei is not about being lazy. Wu Wei leads to the noblest kind of action according to the philosophy of Taoism and is at the heart of what it means to follow the Tao. Perhaps a better way of understanding it is the phrase, going with the flow. Wu Wei is about non-resistance to life, letting things take their natural course. Living in such a way makes life seem effortless. Supposedly, if we stop resisting life, in other words, if we stop trying to control life, it will lead to greater tranquility and flourishing. How do human beings try to control life? Well, through logical thought, even through language, culture, and of course, government. But we take all of these for granted as good things. But according to Taoism, they often interfere with the natural course of the Tao, which is spontaneous. In place of spontaneity, our attempts to control nature and one another lead often to willful cunning and frustration and conflict. Despite the teaching of non-resistance and warnings against trying to control people, Taoism does have instructions about how a wise emperor should govern. In the Tao Te Ching, it states, the way does nothing. Wu Wei is the verbiage there. The way does nothing, and yet nothing remains unaccomplished. In other words, the sage king, the wise ruler, rules by cultivating within himself a constant awareness of and responsiveness to nature, to the Tao. By taking no unnatural action, in other words, by not trying to control the world, the ruler actualizes the Tao within his own life. In doing so, he influences his subjects by the example of his life. He demonstrates to his subjects how a life of natural action promotes a flourishing rather than a stagnant kingdom. Is that a little idealistic sounding to you? I don't know. Let's continue. Verse 60 helps us understand better how the Tao works in governing. Governing a large country is like frying a small fish. You spoil it with too much poking. Center your country in the Tao, and evil will have no power. Not that it isn't there, but you will be able to step out of its way. Give evil nothing to oppose, and it will disappear by itself. What do you think of that? Well, again, this teaching may appear quite naive, maybe, about human nature, overly optimistic and idealistic. That is a fair criticism, and I think we should address that during our Q&A. Now, how do we cultivate, though, this way of living? If we're going to seek to become wiser from the teaching of Taoism, how do we cultivate it in our life? Because living in accord with the nature of things doesn't seem to come naturally to us, does it? Let me say that again. Living in accord with the nature of things doesn't come naturally. Another Taoist text, the Ganzi, offers practical exercises in how we can do this, how we can cultivate a life lived more in tune with nature. It involves, of course, meditation, breathing techniques, and assuming the right posture. From the Ganzi, when your body is not aligned, the inner power will not come. When you are not tranquil within, your mind will not be well ordered. Align your body, assist the inner power. Then it will gradually come on its own. In another Taoist text titled Nei, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it means inward training. It's possibly from the 2nd century BCE. Some believe it's even older than that. We find this description of the meditative techniques to accomplish Wu Wei. When you enlarge your mind and let go of it, when you relax your qi, which is our vital breath, and expand it, when your body is calm and unmoving, and you can maintain the one and discard the myriad disturbances, you will see profit and not be enticed by it. You will see harm and not be frightened by it. relaxed and unwound, yet acutely sensitive. In solitude, you delight in your own person. This is called revolving the vital breath, the key. Your thoughts and deeds seem heavenly. Well, as you can see, this passage defines ki, Qi, as vital breath. It also can refer to air, water, or vapor, like that Hebrew word havel we learned last week. Ki refers to the rhythmic energy that constitutes each and everything. It is cosmic energy itself. In Taoism, energy and matter are one and the same. Our modern science tells us the same. That means each one of us is actually ki itself. Now, some might argue that the Taoist principle of wu-wei, non-resistance and non-control, advocates a kind of anarchy. I guess in theory, yes, it does. But in my research, I found this argument. Anarchy, as it is practiced in the world, is always defined by what it is against. But wu-wei advocates being against nothing, but living in complete acceptance of the natural way of the cosmos and the natural way of the world in which we live. Now, for some of us, wu-wei also may seem to encourage a moral passivity. But listen to this verse from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao can't be perceived. Smaller than an electron, it contains uncountable galaxies. If powerful men and women could remain centered in the Tao, all things would be in harmony. The world would become a paradise. All people would be at peace, and the law would be written in their hearts. When you have names and forms, know that they are provisional. When you have institutions, know where their functions should end. Knowing when to stop, you can avoid any danger. All things end in the Tao, as rivers flow into the sea. Let that sink in a moment. Many of us have experienced conflict with someone where instead of countering their energy with an equal and opposite reaction, which is what we normally do, we acknowledge what they are feeling by reflecting their experience back to them. And have you noticed whenever you have done this, almost immediately, the other person seems to calm down? Well, in a way, that's putting the Tao into ethical practice. Well, the final principle of Taoism I'll discuss is one we actually are acquainted with, yin and yang. We have seen this symbol before. Yin and yang literally refer to the sunny side and shadow side of a hill. Now, here are the attributes of each one. On the yin side, its attributes are negative, female, night, passive, moon, intuitive, cold, soft. And the yang has the attributes of positive, male, day, active sun, logical, hot, and hard. So this symbol refers to the dualities that we experience in this life. However, this is very crucial. The point of the symbol is to express the idea that we flow in and out of these attributes, not that we either possess some of these traits or we don't. Let's make that abundantly clear. This is not an either-or model. It's a both-and. The point is that we are whole when we effortlessly flow from yin to yang and back again. So yin and yang reflect the harmonious interplay of all pairs of opposites in the cosmos. Yin and yang are often referred to as two breaths. Ki, there's that word again, two breaths. The in-breath and the out-breath are the natural way of breathing. It is effortless to breathe. But what if we only took in-breaths. That would be absurd, wouldn't it? But that is how life is when we don't acknowledge all of these attributes within us and don't live in flow with them. We can see how difficult we make life when we act like this. Now, this aspect of Taoism may sound quite wonderful. Who wouldn't want to adopt a philosophy for life in accord with the nature of things? And that leads to both inner tranquility and outer peace in the world. Well, the lingering question I maintained throughout my study of Taoism was this: does it actually work if the vast majority of people on the earth refuse to live in such a way? Is it possible to relinquish control when everyone around me is trying to control me? In all seriousness, how does Taoism actually work in the world? Can it actually work in the world? Aren't all advances in industry and technology that we seem to feel are good things, have equaled progress, aren't these attempts at control of nature? Every country in the world is also managed by a government, and nearly all have a military, for very good reason. People find it quite difficult or simply refuse to live by the principles of Taoism. So isn't the ultimate result of following the Tao, considering the type of world we do live in, to become a perpetual victim to those who seek control? And doesn't it lead to a kind of moral pacifism? These are sincere questions. They're not direct challenges of Taoism. They're just questions that naturally arise when studying Taoism. For example, why should we help the homeless? Isn't helping, and I put helping in quotes here, isn't helping them an infringement on their right to live as they prefer? And how do we know they are homeless? Precisely because they are consciously living according to the Tao. Is it in the nature of the universe to own a house, much less own a car? Is it trying to help, again in quotes, any particular group of people, at bottom an attempt to control them in some way, to force them to conform to societal norms? Well, to answer these questions, I again turn to the Tao Te Ching for clarity. If you want to become whole, let yourself be partial. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. If you want to become full, let yourself be empty. If you want to be reborn, let yourself die. If you want to be given everything, give everything up. Does this verse clarify ethical matters for you? Take a moment to reflect on it before I move on. Read it over if you would. It is verses like this that helped create more legends around Taoism, that Jesus of Nazareth was taught by Taoist masters. Taoists often point to the passage in the Gospel of John as proof of this. I am the way, the Tao, in other words, the truth, and the life. Whenever we find overlaps of the same teaching across cultures and religions and philosophies, it is a sign that we should pay close attention. I would like to close with one of the most famous Chinese proverbs, which wonderfully expresses a manner of life in accord with the Tao. It's titled, Sai Weng Lost His Horse. Some of you might find it familiar. Sai Wing lived on the border and he raised horses for a living. One day he lost one of his prized horses. After hearing of the misfortune, his neighbor felt sorry for him and came to comfort him. But Sai Wing simply asked, "How can we know it is not a good thing for me?" After a while, the lost horse returned, and with another beautiful horse. The neighbor came over again and congratulated Sai Wing on his good fortune. But Sai Wing simply asked, "How can we know it is not a bad thing for me?" One day his son went out for a ride with the new horse. He was violently thrown from the horse and broke his leg. The neighbors once again expressed their condolences to Sai Wing, but Sai Wing simply said, "How can we know it is not a good thing for me?" 1 year later, the emperor's army arrived at the village to recruit all able-bodied men to fight in the war. Because of his injury, Sai Wing's son could not go off to war, and he was spared from certain death. Because most of us have been fully trained our entire life in a very different worldview, Taoism can be rather challenging at first. Challenges me, at least. Considering the world we actually must live in, is it feasible to live without resistance, without attempts to control? Is it possible to live in accord with nature, the cosmos, and experience true peace, while also handling the responsibilities of life well? I'd like to think so. What do you think? Well, thank you for your presence, and thank you in advance for your participation. I open the floor now to any comments you might have or any questions you might have. I fully recognize that some of you, again, are probably much more versed in Taoism and Eastern philosophy than I am, so I really encourage you to share your perspective with the rest of us. All right, the floor is open.